Hi, everybody. This week we're going to talk about word choice in poetry. We're digging into poetry this week, and I hope you enjoy some of the poems you'll read. In this poetry unit, we will not be taking quizzes because I don't know how I would have you take a quiz over poetry. So your grades for this unit really depend on your discussion board posts. So make sure that you are doing a good job because those posts are going to be worth quite a few points. And we're going to collectively work on learning poetry together in the discussion board. So make sure you're active, you're invested in that, because that's where the learning will take place for this unit. Also, you need to make sure that your literary analysis papers are coming along. Be sure you're looking at the handouts on how to write that paper, and you're working on that. So you are making good progress because that is coming up very shortly. So let's talk a little bit about types of poetry and word choice in poetry. Here we go. Okay, so the terms we're going to talk about specifically in this presentation are paraphrase, different types, and then persona, voice, and irony. Okay, so we've talked about irony in fiction already, and we've talked some about voice in fiction, but now we're going to talk about it in poetry. So let's talk about paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is how you approach poetry. Typically, when we do fiction, we summarize, right? We take big chunks and kind of boil it down, and we can summarize the story. With poetry, the content tends to be much shorter, but much richer. So you need to take your time. You cannot gobble poetry like you can fiction. You can't just sit down and sort of devour it all in one bite. Poetry requires you to slow down, which is why a lot of students don't like it. They tell me I don't get poetry. And my answer to them is that's because you don't spend enough time to try to get it. You have to slow down when you read poetry. And so paraphrasing helps you do that. So here's how you paraphrase when you're working on a poem. Put each line in your own words. So that is, you go line by line and work on putting it in your own words. What is this really saying? How does it contribute to the overall feeling that we're looking at? And then see what ideas emerge or what inferences you can make. When you really sit and look at the words themselves and see the play of words back and forth across lines, you'll start to pick out what are the big ideas here. And the weird thing about poetry is that, yeah, sometimes we have breaks in the middle of the line, and the lines can be very short. And as readers, we struggle with that because we're so used to fiction where the words go all the way across the line. So you need to train your brain to think a little differently when you read poetry. Okay. Then look at some of the techniques that the writer is doing. Do you see rhyme? Do you see rhythm? Does it have a rhythm to it? Are there rhyming words? Do you see alliteration and assonance and a lot of these other terms that we're going to talk about over the next couple of weeks? So as you're paraphrasing, this gives you and you're going line by line and trying to put it in your own words, this also gives you the opportunity to process what types of literary tools or techniques is the writer using then in each line. Do I see figurative language in here? Do I see rhyme and rhythm and meter and all of those things? So also, you want to consider, okay, so what is the overall idea of the poem, or what kind of symbols do I see in this poem? A lot of times these symbols are woven throughout the poem. There will be one idea, okay? The thing with poetry is a lot of times we're typically not trying to tell a story. What we're trying to do with poetry is to capture the everyday, which is very different, okay, than telling some, great story. What we try to do in poetry is to take those just everyday moments that strike us and find a way to put it into words. Sometimes it's special moments, sometimes it's dramatic moments, but it's trying to focus on moments and the feelings that those moments give us. So it's very different than storytelling. So when you're reading poetry, consider, okay, what is the moment? Why did the writer choose this particular moment? What is the writer trying to teach me about life in this moment? Okay, because a lot of times what poems are doing is really teaching us about life in general, but doing it through a specific moment where we have some kind of, you know, feeling, we have some kind of experience that touches our heart. And that is the beauty of poetry. One interesting thing about it is we tend to write lots of poems out of tragedy, because it's a way to process those moments and figure out what am I feeling? What are my feelings? And what does it all mean? So poetry is about trying to find meaning in these very specific moments, and what can they teach us about life. So it's different than fiction, but it's not better or worse than fiction. But you do have to read it differently. Okay, you have to slow down and consider. Okay, what is the moment? What is the feeling or the life experience the author's trying to get across to me here? And then the last question is, okay, then how did the writer go about doing that? Did the writer use some kind of literary tools to really drive that point home? So hopefully that's helpful to you to think about poetry differently. You can't read poetry like you read fiction. And when you try to read poetry like fiction, you won't get it. So you do have to read in a different way to appreciate poetry. Okay. So a couple of types we're going to talk about this week. These are some really common types of poetry. That's why we're going to start with these. So a lyric poem is just a short poem that has one specific feeling it's trying to convey. It's typically very short and it comes from one speaker. Okay. A narrative tells a story. So we do get some kinds of story, but usually it's still focusing more on the feeling or the life experience we learn from the moment rather than focusing on the events of the moment. Okay, so the actual chronological, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, tends to be really vague in narrative poetry because it's still not the point. All right. Ballads and epics are two kinds of narrative poetry. So if you've ever read, Dante, or if you've ever read something from Homer, maybe the Iliad or the Odyssey or some of the Greek and Roman literature, a lot of those things are narrative epic poetry, and they're beautiful. So we do get some narrative. Dramatic is when the character speaks directly to us. Okay, or directly to an audience. Usually, dramatic poetry is like Shakespeare, right? It's written for a stage. So that's what we see there. And then didactic poetry is poetry to teach us a lesson. So typically it speaks to the audience and is trying to convey a particular lesson. So those are four that we're going to focus on for this week. One term I want to give you is the term persona. So with fiction, we have a narrator, but you don't get narrators in poetry. What you get is a persona. The persona is the person telling us the story. So it could be a narrator. Okay, we could technically call it a narrator, but we don't call it a narrator in poetry. We call it a persona. So just know that they're similar ideas. Many times the person telling us the story, or the person speaking in a poem, may have different experiences than the author. So the tone that the persona takes about, or the feeling the persona is trying to convey, many times as the reader, we get the understanding that the feeling or the understanding that the persona is having is different than how the author really feels. A lot of times we get this because we have unreliable narrators we can't trust, or because they use young children. So if you read poetry and the persona, the person speaking, is young or naive or innocent or unreliable, that's usually a good indication that what the author feels about the topic and what the persona feels about the topic will be different. There's a gap there between them. So we get this with tone, voice, and irony, especially with satiric poetry. So if you've ever read satire, you know that what the narrator or persona is saying is actually the opposite of what the author is really trying to say. So watch out for tone, voice, and irony. Watch out for satire, because then there is an obvious gap between what the author is really trying to say and what the persona is saying to us in the poem. So be on the lookout for that, but know and use that term. So you won't want to speak about a narrator in poetry. You'll use the persona. All right, last thing. Irony. We've talked about irony in fiction, but you also have irony in poetry. So it's the difference between what the speaker says and what we know to be true. This is where we can see that persona, that the persona and the author are two different people. So you'll see a gap between, again, what the persona says and what we know the author is actually trying to say. Okay. So be on the lookout for that. There's a couple poems where we see that over the next couple of weeks, but be on the lookout for irony, be able to use the term persona. Okay, so make sure you read over all of the poems that we will do, because all of them will be on the test. So even if it's not one you choose to write about in a discussion board post, be sure you read them all, because you will see them all on the test. Make sure you jump in the discussion boards early and often, because that will be your grade for these next couple of weeks. We'll be over the discussion boards because we won't have quizzes, and be working on your literary analysis papers. All right, guys, see you later.